Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's WDSN Careers Panel, Pathways and Opportunities in Defence and National Security. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where I am streaming, the Ngunnawal people. I'd like to pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, and specifically First Nations women and non-binary people. My name's Ashleigh McNeill, and I'm an Events and Communications Officer here at ASPI, and today's moderator. ASPI's Women in Defence and Security Network, or WDSN, is a forum established to support the career development of women in this community. The value of gender and diversity in national security, policy, and defence is well documented. Women are consistently entering the workforce in greater numbers, yet when we look at leadership positions, women's participation is often lacking, whether that be in peace discussions, global governance, or your office. That is why we are here today, to explore the diverse pathways and opportunities available to you to make a full and meaningful contribution to the defence and security sectors. Sharing their own journeys with us today are our four exceptional panellists. First up, Dr. Mundkur is a Senior Practice Advisor at Our Watch and previously was the Head of Gender Equality at Care Australia. Jocelinn Kang, Jo, is the Program Manager and Technical Specialist at ASPI's International Cyber Policy Centre and has previous experience in computer systems, network design, and information security policy. Briony Daley Whitworth is the Director of Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology Branch at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She's had previous experience at the Attorney General's Department and the Department of Home Affairs. And finally, Ariel Bogle is an analyst at ASPI's International Cyber Policy Centre and previously a technology journalist with the ABC. So, I will start by asking each of our panellists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their careers and their experiences so far. If you haven't used this platform before, please find the questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Send through your questions during the discussion and I'll do my best to ask as many as I can. If you'd like a question answered, please make sure to upvote it. So, Briony, if I can please start with you. Can you please share with the audience how your career journey has led you to DFAT and your current role working on international cyber affairs?
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really exciting to see so many people interested in national security careers for women. It's super important, and I'm always here for it. I had a bit of a meandering path towards where I am now. I'm not your typical DFAT person straight out of a master's degree into a grad program and then having several postings and working their way up, which is less and less the case in DFAT now, which is fantastic. We're seeing a lot more diversity. My career path really sort of followed a thread of interest and a thread of excitement. It's quite haphazard at the time. I never really thought what I was doing would get me where I am, but then looking back, I could really see that there was actually a link and a chain throughout it. Thinking about where I came from, I did a degree in science in microbial genetics, very different to where we are now. And at that time, I was not really interested in pursuing lab work as a career, and so I was looking at all sorts of different things I could do. And while I was sort of enrolling in honours, I started doing internships and volunteering and all sorts of different things to see what was of interest and what I actually wanted to do. Turned out I really liked the legal internships that I was doing. But when I was looking at that, I remember seeing internships at the UN that I thought looked so interesting and so exciting, and thinking I could never ever do that. I wouldn't even think about applying. And here, about a decade later, I'm Australia's head of delegation for UN cyber processes at the UN, which is ridiculous and exciting. And one of those ridiculous things where you look back and you think, a younger me could never have imagined coming this far. So how did I do that? Very randomly. So I studied law, and while I was studying law, I always knew that I didn't want to do the corporate thing. So I was looking at working in other areas. I tried some internships and working in native title, in carbon farming, because that was a thing back then. I worked with refugee organizations, and I did all sorts of different things around the edges, and looked at all sorts of things there. And what I really found an interest in was fairness and government accountability. And so when it came to finding a job after my law degree, I applied for a position with the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which is a legal body that works to review the decisions of government that affect citizens and whether or not they were made in the right manner and how they work. So when I was working there, I really found an interest in information and privacy decisions and the decisions we were making about the media. And so I was already thinking about that sort of more information side of things. And when an opportunity came up to work in privacy and information at Attorney General's Department, I jumped at that. And it was when I was working in that job and doing a lot of legal advice work that I realized I spent about 18 months working in that area and really understood much more about how government works internally, and got exposed to the idea of policy development, not just legal advice. And that's where I sort of started to realize that, and something that I've definitely pursued since then, is that while giving legal advice is incredibly interesting and in-depth, it's the people who work in policy that actually get to make the decisions based on the legal advice. And that was something that always intrigued me. So I then started working in telecommunications security policy and cybercrime policy, and started speaking up because I saw that there was a little bit of an international angle to this, and it harked back to my interest back many years ago in working internationally. And so speaking up about my international interest meant that I got given those opportunities and started working on those more international side of things. And then when my boss at that time left, there was no one else to take it over. So I got to step into that role and start working on the Budapest Convention, which is a cybercrime convention that Australia is a member of, a party to, and ended up just being the right person who had the background to start negotiating and getting to travel to Strasbourg and work on cyber issues in a multilateral forum. And that led me to build those skills in multilateral negotiations, but also in the expertise in cyber and technology and digital issues, so that when an opportunity came up at DFAT where they needed cyber multilateral negotiators, I was in the right place at the right time with the right skills to jump in and say, hello, me, me. And so I moved to DFAT 2.5 years ago to continue working on cyber and multilateral issues, and have spent the last 2 years working as an advisor, a policy advisor, to the head of delegation for UN cyber processes. And when she moved on about 4 months ago, that put me in the perfect position to be the one to take over that role, because I had learned everything from her. So that's where I am now. I will stop there because we've taken a bit of time, but I'm really interested to hear your questions and how everyone else has things to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Briony. That sounds really interesting. A nice, very diverse career path. Can I please now turn to you, Jocelyn? So your background in technology mightn't be considered the typical route to an international career. Can you share with the audience your career to date and how your technical skills have contributed to your work at ASPI?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. Absolutely. I also did not know. So in terms of imagining where my career would be, I don't do much imagining. I think if you ask me where I'll be in 5 years, I still don't know. But I certainly followed my interests, and so I think part of it is a lot of I guess a background. The technical background is less about knowing. Now it's less about knowing exactly how technology works, and rather drawing out the so what of technology. So the so what for policymakers. So what are the implications of the application of technology, rather than exactly how it works. So I think that's for my role in ASPI right now. That's the key to it. Was there another part of that question?
No, I wasn't sure if you wanted to explain how maybe you got to the role at ASPI, maybe a bit of a career journey, but yeah. So I guess my career started
pretty early. I had very generous and generous parents with the foresight to see that digital and technology and computer skills was going to be the future. So I spent my high school holidays getting a technical industry certification, which ended up being really good for me, meaning that university holidays were filled with unpaid work experience or paid work experience in my field, which, to be honest, I actually never really wanted to be in. So if you asked me if I wanted to be in computers, do a career in computers, no, that was not it. Similar to Briony, like, you don't think there's a chain. You're like, oh, I don't want to do this, but I end up in these jobs that match my skills, but not necessarily my interests. But if I look back at it, everything has technology in it. It's just that it wasn't the hardcore technical programming and all of that I didn't really enjoy. It's everything's related to technology though, so there is a theme throughout the career. So yeah, I spent my first beginning my career in a software startup, doing technical support of spyware, malware detection software. And then I moved to government for a decade, and that's where I built up my skills designing and building and securing networks and systems. I believe these days they call that cybersecurity. Somewhat, I think, to the detriment of trying to recruit into cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is actually quite wide, and there are a range of skills, from the highly technical to the things in between, to things that you wouldn't think are part of cybersecurity, like project management, super important. Even marketing skills. Those are all skills needed in that sector. So after my time in government, I retired from government, and I went to pursue what I thought was my dream job, to be a barista and a bike mechanic. Yes, at the same time. And it turns out in Canberra, you can actually do that. But I quickly learnt that although this was what I thought was my dream job, I probably have to drink a lot more coffee to be a good barista. So I pursued something else, which was a fitness career. And whilst I was studying for this fitness certification, I came across ASPI's, the Cyber Policy Centre's work, and it just drew my interest. I wasn't looking for a job. It just seemed interesting, and I wanted to be part of it. So I cold called, essentially. I just emailed, and here I am. So yes, a meandering path, not one you would think to take, and here I am, and quite happy. The key to it though is following your interest. I followed my interests, and that's what's driven my career.
Thanks, Jo. That was really interesting. It was good to see a different side of the technology field, for sure. Anu, if I can go over to you now, do you mind sharing your career journey with the audience and how you've been able to centre your work around your passion for gender equality?
Thanks, Ashleigh. I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a journalist way back in 1990, and I had a master's degree in English and political science. So I thought, there I am. This is what I'm going to do. Little did I realize that newspapers did not give women the political beat. We got to write lovely, fluffy stories about parties that happened in Bangalore, the city that I lived in and grew up in. And very quickly, that was not going to be something that I was remotely interested in or wanted to do. And it was quite opportunistic that I got introduced to ActionAid, which had its headquarters in India at that time in the city of Bangalore. And they were looking for someone in their communications department. And so my writing skills sort of matched that job description. And I said, well, why not? Knew nothing about NGOs, knew nothing about development. All I was interested in was in writing. And so I joined ActionAid as in their communications team, and very quickly realized the complex world of international development and the highly political and power struggles in the NGO world around what is development, what is poverty, who do we work with, why do we work with certain groups and not others. And so that informed a lot of the communications that I did. For I think it was my grounding in understanding how gender equality really impacts who has access to power and who doesn't, who has access to resources, who controls resources, who makes decisions. And so we were doing all these programs that quote unquote were around women's empowerment. And it really made me question, though, to what extent were women really being empowered, or were we just being able to do our work better? Which I think is important. Easing the burden of everyday work is important, but is that really what empowerment is? And ActionAid has come a long, long way since the 1990s. It's now, I think, one of the organizations that I admire the most in terms of how they have taken up the challenge of decolonizing development. They've taken up the challenge of looking at gender equality as part and parcel of every single program that they do. That was not the organization in the 1990s. And so when my boss, who was male, left, I thought, having worked with the organization for 6 years by then, that I would naturally step into the role. And I was told, no, I couldn't, because I didn't have a degree in communications. And the role went to a male with a degree in communications. And I was like, oh, is that what it is? Is it a degree? I will apply. Well, I'll get another degree. The challenge, of course, is in India, your education is age dependent. So you can't go back and do a master's if you've already done a master's. And so the only option for me was to go abroad. And so I went to the US and I got a degree in communications from the University of Southern California and the Annenberg School. And while I was there, though, I really got interested in the so what of technology, as Jocelyn said, because India had begun investing very heavily in e-governance, and it was going to fundamentally change the way in which citizens participated in government decision-making, and it was going to make decision-making more transparent and more accountable. And my professor at that time sort of encouraged me to apply for a PhD, because he said there were very few people who had a practice base and an ability to do critical research. And so I bit the bullet and applied for a PhD, and my PhD is in e-governance, and it actually looks at to what extent does technology exclude certain groups from government decision making. So it's, so not believing that technology in and of itself will fundamentally change the world, a recognition that we build our biases into technology. And unless you are actually questioning that, and unless you're doing something specifically to include marginalized groups, they are going to be left out. And lo and behold, the groups that got left out were largely women, because there are a whole set of gender norms around women and tech, women and don't do tech. And so there was, so that was what my PhD was in, and looking at governance. And I really thought I'd just continue in India. And it just so happened that my partner got an opportunity to come to Australia to do a scholarship here and study at Flinders. And so I came here so when I came to Australia, my background was, because I had a PhD, I had teaching experience, I had research experience, and I had experience working in the field with nonprofit organizations. So it was quite opportunistic that Flinders at that time was looking to set up a gender consortium, a consortium of people who were going to be looking at gender issues and supporting DFAT's programming in gender in Indonesia. From there, I've gone to, and while in Indonesia, actually looking at gender and development in Indonesia, looking at the hotspots in Indonesia like Aceh, I got really interested in the security side of things and women's role in peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. So that was my into looking at security and women, peace and security. What does that actually mean? How do we, well, theoretically, what does it mean, but also what does it mean on the ground, and what is the role, what role can women play in women, peace and security? And having done, with the background in research, I was able to do quite a few research projects on that space, which then sort of, made me one of the few people who looked at women, peace and security, and hence then got drawn into giving a lot of policy advice in this space. Worked with the Australian Civil Military Centre and looking at humanitarian response and why that needs to be gendered, again, drawing in a lot of the training, teaching experience, opportunities at CARE to head up their gender equality unit. And I think now I've sort of made a lateral movement to Our Watch, which looks, so for those who don't know, Our Watch is a national organization that works on the primary prevention of violence against women. And so for me, it's a lateral movement into a domestic space, And I felt it was the right time to do that, because I think there's so much interesting stuff happening in the international space, but we don't actually draw it into what's happening in Australia. And I saw myself as being able to bridge that gap, having had the experience of having worked in pretty much every country in the Asia Pacific on very similar issues, violence against women's issues, whether we look at it from a security angle or not, or from a development angle, isn't that different from what you see in Australia. So what could we learn and how could we bridge the gap? And that's where I've ended up at Our Watch. I'm still very active in the WPS space, working with the Women, Peace and Security Coalition, the Australian Civil Society Coalition. So I keep my interest in that space, but I'm constantly learning and drawing to inform the work that I do today.
Thank you so much, Anu. That's so interesting, hearing about the domestic and international sides of gender insecurity. Ariel, so turning to you, can you tell us a little bit about your career path and a bit about your jump from journalism into the think tank world as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, and thanks to the panelists. It's really interesting so far. I would say that the common thread here is a sort of meandering career path, and I've definitely had the same, I think. My first sort of interest in technology and policy came at university. So I did, in my law degree, I had a class, like an intellectual property semester. And I think there's so many interesting issues that emerged in that conversation that I decided I really wanted to focus on that. And I wasn't sure whether to focus on it in like become an IP lawyer type of way, become a policy person. I did a policy internship at Google, looking at safe harbor legislation around how like Google search works and things like that. And then I took a left turn and was like, no, I want to work in book publishing. So I went to New York and worked at a book publisher as an intern, and then started working there. But funnily enough, the book publisher, Melville House, had a blog at the time that was sort of like an industry news blog. And I started writing about the impact of technology on the book industry. So, things like Kindle, Amazon's sort of stranglehold on the book industry, and all kind of related issues. And from that, when I decided I was actually perhaps more interested in journalism or technology policy, it actually helped me get back in because of that blog. So I started working at a think tank actually in Washington, D.C. called New America, which is running a program called Future Tense with Slate, which is a news website in the US. And we would put on events around emerging technologies, and I would write for Slate about a variety of different technology issues. So when I decided to come back to Australia, there aren't that, I started working at Mashable, which was a kind of technology website that had just opened in Australia at that time, was kind of part of the digital media boom that's kind of crashed in recent years. But I started working for them, and I think it's quite galvanizing. The Australian government had just passed the metadata legislation, and that was really a big issue at the time. And I started there to kind of build, I guess, a reporting focus. The technology beat is so huge on a few sort of buckets, one being government technology policy. So over the years at Mashable, but then at the ABC as well, I've been covering, government and security and technology. So that would be like the metadata legislation, of course, but encryption laws, My Health Record, like all these government projects where that sort of are a Venn diagram of, how the technology actually works, legislation around it, how that legislation may conflict with other parts of law or social norms, and then cultural practice, what we expect of our government or we expect of privacy when it comes to the internet. So Mashable had a stint at The Conversation as technology editor, and then moved across to the ABC. And I guess over the past few years at the ABC, I was sort of still reporting on that technology and security and privacy space, but also reporting a lot on issues around online culture when it came to disinformation and propaganda and things like that. During the 2019 election, for example, I was part of the ABC's hidden campaign project, where we tried to understand the kind of advertising Australians were seeing during the election, the non-traditional advertising. So not your television ads, but all the ads you started to see on YouTube videos or on Google ads when you played like Words with Friends and all that kind of thing. And then, of course, during since the beginning of COVID last year, I was covering the kind of misinformation and conspiracy theories and the kind of industries that were building up around this type of content. So yeah, when the opportunity came up to join ASPI, the Cyber Policy Centre at ASPI, and specifically the disinformation team here, I really jumped at it just to, I suppose, double down on some of those skills when it comes to looking at disinformation and online information ecosystems, just kind of build more of those technical skills around examining larger data sets. And I guess broadly too, like anyone that's watched the media industry knows how fragile the media industry can be. And so any opportunity to kind of build your skill set and make sure that you have a lot to offer, so that when your media company inevitably collapses, that you have some options. Of course, the ABC is a different kind of funding model, but yes, a career in media tells you need to be kind of prepared for anything. So having multiple skills, I think, is really important. And I'm sure that's applicable across multiple industries.
Thanks so much, Ariel. That was really interesting. So I've got a few questions for the panelists now. I'm just going to remind you, make sure you get all your questions ready in the bar on the side. Looking at the moment, it looks like a lot of people are really interested in how they can get ahead in their career and stand out in a huge pool of applicants. I might go to you, Anu, first, because you were talking about how you use your work to stand out and be the best person to talk on your issue. Do you have advice for the audience on how they can try and stand out?
A couple of things. One is, I think, really look at how you talk about your skills in your CVs. I think we tend to write our CVs in terms of, this is my job description, this was my job title, and this is what I did. Or, here's my education. I think we should be writing skills-based CVs so that you're talking about the skills that your employer or whoever you're interested in is you're applying to, picks up on the particular skills that that job does. So that's one thing I think, really looking at our CVs. The mistake I made when I first came, my CV was like 15 pages or some nonsense like that, because I had every single job that I did, every single book that I had written, every single paper. And that was the standard that went to everyone, and I realized quite quickly that that was a bad strategy. You actually need to tailor. So it does take time to apply for work. So, really invest that time in thinking about what it is you want to convey. The other thing that I would say is, I think there's a question in the list around, you haven't had opportunities to do paid or unpaid internships. I never did a paid or an unpaid internship. I could never have done an unpaid internship anyway, because I had to support myself. So, and paid internships, there aren't that many in the development sector. There aren't many nonprofits who will pay you to come and work for them, right? And so the couple of things that I did was to get myself known, I started writing. And anything that I did, I tried to get it published, either in a peer-reviewed journal, or if not in a peer-reviewed journal, as a blog or somewhere where your name starts getting noticed. So if you have a particular stream that you want to be in, try and find out which one, which blogs or which sources of information will policymakers or NGOs be looking at, and try and start writing in those spaces so that you start getting noticed. The other thing is, I think, lateral movement. Like, we always think that in our career paths, we have to keep moving up. For me, that was, and that's just for me, right? Know yourself as well. I know that I don't want to be a CEO of an NGO. That's not my ambition at all. I really love the policy world. I really love the policy advice world. I love working with communities. And so, instead of looking for upward movement, I always look for lateral movement. And there can be growth in lateral movement. It's not as if, you necessarily have to take a salary cut to move laterally. You can move laterally and earn better, do better, get different kinds of experiences. So those would be, I think, the things that you would look at if you were, wanting to get yourself known. Look at your CV, start writing, because, lots of people are reading these days. And also keep yourself abreast with what's happening. So I actually have, to this day, a reading day. Fridays are my reading day. So it's so it's almost as if I collect all these articles and they wait for Friday so that I can then spend, the day just reading and keeping myself, so that the next time someone asks me to say something, I say something intelligent because I have just read something. Again, that gets you noticed. And one final thing, if you're working in the gender space, and I'm saying this with a person who has very few diplomacy skills, like I would never work in the UN. They would throw me out like tomorrow because I can't keep my mouth shut. Like if I see something, I have to say something about it, right? But I have learned, I think my biggest learning at the Civ Mill Center was how do I get my message across when I know I have a resistant audience, right? So thinking about different ways in which you say things, which comes from then writing for different audiences as well. Like, the same message, like how I write for an NGO and talk about human rights is probably not the same way in which I would talk to a business about promoting gender equality and workplace equality and respect. I'd be using the same messages, but framing them very differently. So keeping all those things in mind so that when you are in front of an audience, you are primed to make yourself really articulate so that, your voice is heard. And I will say, never keep silent. Like, don't be embarrassed to be the one who puts your hand up first. And someone says, any questions? Yep, I have one. Like always, so that you do get noticed. I think those are sort of tips that I have.
I just to add to the CV thing, I think one of the most important CV writing things I learned was as Anne was saying, like not a job description, but an action. Like I, led X team and we achieved a report that was downloaded 50,000 times or something, like everything, an action. That was one of the most important things that I was told. And also there's like a strange cultural adaptation with cover letters. So in America, they want your cover letters to be like a story, like a sort of like, I've always dreamed, I can't come think of this, but you have to think about that cultural context. I mean, if you're only applying for public service jobs, I'm sure there's a form there that I'm not really familiar with. But I will say that like a cover letter for a US employer is different from an Australian, which is a little more straight to the point, different from an Indonesia, et cetera. So there's like, everything needs to be adapted. Unfortunately, it does take a long time.
Thank you, Ariel and Anu. That was great. I can definitely see how people have got the skills and they can transfer them to different contexts. Just looking at our questions on the side, and our top voted question there is one that I, very similar to one that I had devised myself. So that's for you, Briony. Working in technology and diplomacy, it can be considered a very male-dominated field. So firstly, would you yourself define it as that? And then secondly, what sort of barriers do you see for women trying to enter this area, and how can they overcome that?
Thank you. And thank you for the question. It is a huge question. It is an issue. There is an entire report by Anuradha on, it's called, something about the curve. I'll find it and get you guys to send it through, because it's all about the fact that we do not have enough women working on the pointier end of diplomacy. So things in international peace and security in particular. So disarmament, nuclear deals, cybersecurity issues. And it shows that while we have increased a lot of the participation of women in the softer side of diplomacy, so you're seeing a lot of equal representation of women in economic and social and development discussions, we're still seeing less than 20 or 30% of discussions on the pointy security end in the UN being led by or involved with women. And then at the same time, we also have all of this evidence that shows that if you have women at the table during peace negotiations, those agreements stick better and last longer than the agreements that are negotiated without women. So we have a problem, and we have like evidence that shows that it is actually a problem. So what do we do about it? I run a Women in Security, a Women in Cyber Fellowship, which is one of the ways that we're doing things like this. So that is where Australia and several other countries sponsor women diplomats, mid-career diplomats from developing countries to come and be involved in these discussions. And we provide the training, workshops, networking is a huge part of that. And understanding of both the policy issues, but also how to actually be a diplomat in these discussions. So that's one thing we do. But I think for me and for my personal journey, I've realized that being a diplomat for Australia is actually perfect for my style of diplomacy, because Australia is a middle power. We're not going to be the 800-kilo gorilla in the room. We can't, and I can't be the bully in the room. That's not my style. But we have a really good reputation as the conciliator, as the bridge builder, as the person or the country that is able to talk to everyone. Many of our close allies can't talk to certain countries openly. They have a lot of restrictions around that. Australia doesn't have those restrictions, so I can talk to my counterparts in countries like China and Russia and North Korea, where other Five Eyes countries, for example, may have limitations on the discussions that they can have bilaterally with those countries. So building relationships and building the understanding is something that is great for Australia, and also something that often comes more naturally to women than to men, and being able to build those bridges and actually listen to what those other countries are saying to find those points where we actually have things in common. There was an example last year. We were in these very tense negotiations on how international law applies in cyberspace. And there was a point where we realized that Australia and Iran actually had a couple of points in common. And that's something that you don't usually find. So we reached out to the Iranian diplomats and said, let's have a bilateral, let's talk about this, let's find these areas where we can actually say Australia agrees with Iran on X, Y, and Z. We don't agree with Iran on A, B, and C, but here are some points where we can actually find that middle ground and work together. So that's sort of the approach that we take and that I've taken. I think as a woman, I've always been much more comfortable if I go into a meeting knowing that I know my stuff better than everyone else in that room. So doing the homework, so that if a man, which has happened on occasion, comes in and says, oh no, blah, 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 I can point to it and say, no, in this resolution here, this is not consensus, you voted against it, X, Y, Z. And that's very scary to do. And I definitely built up my confidence in doing that by using things like in the first negotiations I went to for the Budapest Convention in Strasbourg, I was very much had an unfair advantage because these negotiations all take place in English. So I could intervene with like small things like that's not actually a sentence, and then build up my confidence to actually make interventions that were harder and stronger. So different bits and pieces like that. What else would I say? I'm not sure. I think I would like to speak a little bit about APS applications because I've seen a couple of questions there, but I'm happy to leave that until, should I do that now or?
I'm happy for you to talk about it now if you want, yeah.
Sure, just because I know that, I know Joe, you've worked in the APS as well, but it's something that we deal with all the time. And I think it's one of those tricky things to see getting into the APS and how that actually works is quite different from the outside and the inside. So I've seen a couple of questions here about grad programs and how to sell yourself for the APS. So I would just suggest that you look at things that aren't just grad programs. They tend to be incredibly competitive, but there are a whole lot of other jobs out there that can get you into the APS. On APS jobs that are not grad programs and that are probably better paid than grad programs and require less skills and less experience. So I would think about broadening what you're looking at there and think about what department, once you're in the APS, it's really hard to get out. So once you're in, you can transfer quite easily between departments. And that's something that's a lot of people don't really think about when they're trying to join. So you may not necessarily be interested in the Department of Agriculture, but you can get in there and then learn the skills. They do have some national security issues. They do deal with cybersecurity and build up your skills and your understanding of the APS and then be in a better place to transfer to where you actually want to be, which might be the pointier end of ASD or agriculture does do a lot of international standards negotiations, and you can build up your international skills there and then transfer into DFAT. So there are a lot of different pathways. And the other thing I would just say for applications is they're a world of themselves. There's a lot of advice online, but make sure that you are looking at the performance expectations for that particular department that you're applying for, and for the level that you're applying for, and you're using all the keywords that are in there, because otherwise it's very easy just to ignore that application.
Thanks, Briony.
Yeah.
That's really good. Oh, sorry, Jo, did you want to pop in?
I was just going to add to that. Yep. Definitely can second Briony's advice that you just need to get your foot in the door with the APS, and then it's actually quite hard to leave. But the point is that there's many opportunities, and for myself in my career, this might be a bit old now, but I mean, I found the STAR method pretty good in applications. So I think it's situation, task, action, result. I'd say look it up online, STAR. That I found those pretty good for APS applications. And back on Anu's point about skills, I think it's very key that if you haven't worked, I know some of the questions are about not working for a while, or not being in a particular industry. That doesn't mean you haven't lived and gained experience. And so, this may sound silly, but I did work at a bike shop. I had no sales experience prior to this, but working in tech and as part of the software cycle, you gather requirements before building a system for a customer. And so that, requirements gathering process is the same as talking to a customer and finding out what they need and what kind of bicycle or whatever it is that they're after. So those think about those kind of skills. And although I come from a technical background and now I'm policy, the key thread throughout that is critical thinking and an analytical mind. So there are these common threads. So have a think about that. Back to the APS. There used to be this integrated leadership system, and at the APS, I don't know if it's still about. Someone please jump in if you know, Briony. Basically, it would, if you know which level you want to join at, which APS level, it will tell you the expectations of that level. Like, should you just be following instructions, or are you expected to have strategic thinking, that kind of thing. So have a look at that. It was called integrated learning system. No, wait, integrated leadership system, I think. ILS.
So yeah, I think that's the performance expectations that I was talking about. It sounds like the exact same thing. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jo and Briony. There are some really good insights there. Jo, I just wanted to jump back onto sort of what you were talking about before. In one of the questions, people are talking about making a big career change. I think an aspect of that is taking risk, and lots of studies talk about women being more risk adverse. I'd like to know maybe how you manage risk in your career, maybe some of the things that went through your mind when you quit your government job to work at the bike shop, or coming back into the workforce. And then also perhaps Ariel or Anu, you guys both moved overseas, and that's a huge commitment and a big risk to take. So I'd just like to see how you guys manage risk and reward with that as well.
Sure thing, Ash. So I actually left my well-paying, very comfortable and enjoyable public service job without another job to go to. And people say, I had a lot of comments about, how, either crazy I was or how brave I was. But having done that, I can say it was the most liberating, absolutely liberating experience ever. I realized after I handed in my resignation that really the world is my oyster. I could do anything that I wanted to do. And yes, it was to follow what I thought was going to be my dream job. Didn't work out, but I had the experience to do that. So I would say, if you're in this situation too, and I understand there's a financial part to this as well, if you're in the situation too, I would recommend that to anybody, because you realize that if you have something that you want to obtain. So although I don't have, a 5-year career goal, or where I want to be in 5 years for my career, I do have goals within certain roles that I've had. So I've tried to achieve those. And when it came to a new job, it was, everything is out there and it could be anything. And so I sat down and I still don't know what career I want, but I really thought about what things interest me. And that was that common thread about, I like problem solving. I like analysis and critical thinking. So attributes like that. So as opposed to really thinking about what job, because there's so many jobs out there, think about what it is, what your personal, I think for me, I thought about what my personality is like and what my interests are.
Awesome. Thank you, Jo. Anu or Ariel, would either one of you like to jump in there? Or?
Ariel, do you want to go? I'll go after you.
Sure. Either way. Yeah, I've been thinking about risk. I find it a hard one to advise on because I feel like I have to be, upfront. Like I don't have any children. When I went to the United States, I could do so because I have a US citizenship. Like these are all distinctly like privileges that allow me to take risks, and certainly like I don't regret them or anything like that. But I don't want to like say that risk taking is easy, and just So just to be upfront about that. But I mean, if you are able to take those calculated risks, it can really pay off. I don't know so much about public service work, but certainly in the industries I've worked in journalism in particular, and to some degree like policy work, Australia has a mixed view of itself. We are like proud, we're middle power, etc. But there's always like a lot of kudos paid fairly or unfairly, often unfairly, to having overseas experience. It does not always mean that you're a better candidate or you'll be better at your job, but there is some payoff there. So that can help from a career perspective. I would say that my time in the United States was really helpful in sort of expanding my horizons, making me think of journalism in particular as like being part of like a global industry and not having to go through the traditional paths in Australian media, which might be a cadetship, which are like getting into the APS through graduate programs are really hard to get into. It did let me kind of come through the side door, which was really worthwhile.
Like Ariel, I think I have to acknowledge that I've come from a very privileged background, whether it was in terms of, the kinds of education that I had or in terms of the kinds of choices I have to make and I have been able to make. And I do have a different take on risk and women. I don't buy this argument that women aren't risk takers. I think the challenge is we have such gendered norms in place that make it difficult for women to take those risks and to fulfill those requirements of, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a mother. So I really don't think women are less risk takers. I think they just have a lot to balance when it comes to making decisions around risk. I think moving, as I said, because of my privilege, I've been, I'm like Ariel, I don't have kids. I have a very supportive partner. And so I've been able to move quite easily. But part of that is also because I have developed a skill set that allows me to be more adaptable. So being, when I was in the US, building up those teaching skills meant that when I came to Australia, I could get a teaching job into university. Having done research before, I could do research work, and I used my teaching and research to get me the kind of work that I wanted to do with DFAT around gender. Right. So then built up my skills then around doing work for a donor agency and got known for the work that I did with the donor agency. So, then developed all those skills related to project management, which I didn't necessarily have, a lot of content-based stuff around DFAT and how DFAT works, and learned, I think there's a question somewhere in the list about networking. I am the worst at networking. I have to really psych myself up to go into a networking forum. I find it extremely stressful, but it is important. And I did have to, steel myself literally and be part of or go to DFAT networking events and meet people and get to know people who then sort of, the next time work came around and say, oh, I know that person at Flinders who did X, Y, and Z. Maybe we should get in touch with her. So it does work that way. For me, the biggest risk I took was actually moving to the domestic sector. So I didn't leave care because I wanted to leave care. I was made redundant. And that was, believe me, the scariest. I have never not worked. I've never not had a job. And being made redundant was this, I really didn't know what I would do. Like, what does one do when you become redundant? Like in the middle of COVID, there's, first of all, the development sector is shrinking. NGOs have, very little money. At that point in time, there wasn't even job seeker. There wasn't even conversations around job seeker for NGOs. It was like, oh my God, I'm staring, I don't know, homelessness in the face, literally. And I had to very quickly say, what are my skill sets? My skill sets are in doing work around gender and development. And maybe this is an opportunity to set up a consultancy in that space, because it's not as if people don't want these skills. They do. Maybe it can't get me as much money as I would have got in a salaried position, but it will keep me going. And so I bit the bullet and set up a consultancy, knowing that, it's going to take me time to build. But because I already had so many connections in the space, work started coming in fairly quickly. And I also then, had this parallel strategy of, applying for a job. And it was quite lucky that I found something in our watch that they were looking for someone with my skill sets. So, that happened. But I still maintain a full-time job and do my consultancy because, that's me being risk averse. Because I do know that this is a shrinking space and you won't know. So for me, it's knowing your skill sets and knowing that actually there is a market for your skill set. And to begin marketing yourself quite, it's easy for me to say this now, but believe me, I'm still quite bad at it. I'm really not good at marketing myself. Like, I don't put my name up in big gold letters anywhere. But if that's not your personality, you don't have to do it that way. You can do it by getting to know people, by making those strategic contacts, by keeping in touch with people, which is what I do. And as I said, keeping yourself known to your group, either through your writing or through seminars or through, the whatever forums that you are part of, and making that effort at networking, even when it's really hard, even if it's just, getting there and spending 15 minutes because you can't spend the hour because you have other responsibilities. In those 15 minutes, if you can carve out that time, strongly recommend that you do. But believe me, whether you're coming in new, it's harder to set up consultancy work if you're coming in new. If you're mid-career, so this is really advice for those people who are in their mid-career parts of their lives, you have a whole bunch of skill sets that are sellable. So really think about it. The nice thing about me being able to do consultancy work is now I pick and choose what I do. And I really like that. I don't have to do all the work on, designing a program or, designing a development program. I don't have to do that. I did a gender analysis for COVID-19 in 5 countries, sitting here in Adelaide, which I really enjoyed doing, but helped me connect then with NGOs in India and Bangladesh, and so keep those connections alive. I did a project with peace building organizations across Europe and Latin America on how to build gender into peace building. How do you make it part of your DNA? It was a really short consultancy, and as someone would say, someone told me, as the head of gender equality, what the hell are you doing, running workshops on learning and development? But I was like, well, actually, I enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed being able to run those workshops and, bring my knowledge of women, peace and security into those discussions and help those organizations think. So, being able to market those skills through a consultancy really helps. And if you can then do that consultancy with a couple of other people, which is what I found, is that once I started this and then contacted people, they said, oh, I can't do this work. There's too much. I've got too much on. Do you think you could take on this part of it? So becoming a subcontract for someone else builds your consultancy business. Do think about that. Do think about lateral movements, don't always, and a couple of lateral movements might get you to that more senior position, rather than aiming for that senior position right off the bat. Also gives you some amount of work-life balance. For those who really require it or who are struggling with it, being on your own allows you to make those kinds of choices, I think.
Can I just add one more thing about risk? I think it's important to take the risks that you'll fail. So, I mean, in my own personal experience, there was this one particular role that I really wanted, and it took me 1.5 years and 4 failed interviews before I got that job. But I really wanted the job, and the way that I progressed through that was, I guess I believed in myself, but I also constantly asked for feedback. I said, what do I need to do to get this position? And essentially I spent that 1.5 years, and this was in the public service, so I had the opportunity as well. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to shift and to add to my, I can't remember, KPIs, I guess, experiences that would help me gain the experience to get that next job.
Yeah, I love that point about making mistakes. I think it's often not spoken enough about, especially when people like to highlight their successes. I think we've probably only got time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'd like to go back to Meg's question in the comments about networking. She specifically asks if there's any specific networks that people have used and they found successful. And then I think I'd also like to touch on maybe mentorship. If anyone on the panel has had experience as a mentor or mentoring someone else, and how to go about getting that. I think, Briony, you've spoken about having mentorship experience. If you wanted to take that one first.
Thank you. Yes, I am hugely passionate and about, I wouldn't necessarily call them mentors, because I think mentor is something that is specific and a very specific relationship that you can have, but something that I've seen really work well and have been the beneficiary of and have tried to make sure that I am also promoting other women is champions. I call these people champions. They're people who are usually 1 or 2 steps above you in your career, who you can work with, who recognize your potential. They've always been women for me. I don't know if that's just a thing, but women looking after women is something that I've definitely noticed has been something that I have been very privileged to partake of. And someone who is willing to put you forward for things, which is why not necessarily having a mentor, because I don't think that having a mentor who is your boss or who is your boss's boss is a very conducive relationship. I think that the mentors that I've had in the past have tended to be people who are not in my direct line of hierarchy, because that could get a little bit complicated. So looking for mentors outside of that, but looking for champions in that line of hierarchy who can really put you forward, and having a conversation with someone saying exactly what it is that you want. So making sure that I've been very clear with my supervisors and with everyone what it is that I want, what it is I'm interested in. Saying I want to be a cyber negotiator. That's not actually a job at the time that I say that that's what I want, but making sure that someone can see that. And so when they go, oh, you're interested in international things, we'll put you forward for that stuff, or you're interested in building these skills. And then that comes with the flip side, which is making sure that you actually take the time to learn from these people. I don't think everything should always be about the next promotion and the next progression and the next thing and trying to climb that ladder. Taking the time to actually become an expert, to build those skills, as Jo was saying, I think is incredibly important. And it also gives you the time to grow your understanding of the expertise from mentors, from women who can provide that example. One story I have is one of my first trips to New York. Myself and another team member were supporting a head of delegation, and this other team member, who was a man, complained about the fact that he's like, oh, I just have to carry the fucking handbag. Sorry, I shouldn't swear. And it took me aback, because I thought, you're not seeing that the opportunity is here. By carrying the bag, we are in behind closed doors, watching this wizardry of negotiation happening. And we're only there because we're carrying the handbag, and taking that opportunity and learning from it rather than being annoyed at being the person who has to carry the handbag. And so yeah, I think that would be what I would say, like take stock and think about taking the time to actually learn the things that you need to. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Briony. So we are out of time today. There's so many great questions and we could definitely continue this discussion for a long time. So make sure you do follow WDSN on our Twitter, Facebook. We've got an upcoming newsletter. And then if you want to revisit this panel itself, it will be recorded and on our YouTube, which is ASPI Canberra. I'd like to thank our panelists again for joining us today and sharing their experiences, and to the audience for coming out as well. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your days.